Hello and welcome to a brand new episode of Majlis and Markets with your host Hassan Javraj. Majlis and Markets aims to bring you thought-provoking conversations with influential leaders in Islamic and global markets. In today's episode, we're diving into Turkey's economy. Since the presidential elections in May 2023, Turkey has shifted back to orthodox economic policymaking. This included the appointment of Mehmet Şimşek, a well-respected figure, as finance minister, and adopting more conventional economic policies. With a renewed focus on containing inflation, stabilising the currency, and attracting foreign investors, Turkey is slowly recovering from years of economic strain. Notably, diplomatic relations with the UAE and Saudi Arabia have improved, leading to increased investment and trade. As municipal elections loom on March 31st, we spoke to Atilla Yaşarada, a respected economist and political commentator, to delve into Turkey's economic and political journey. Atilla Yaşarada, welcome to Majlis and Markets. Good to have you here.
It's great to be with you, and I'm looking forward to an exciting conversation.
Likewise. Attila, you've got like a very interesting background. You're like probably one of the leading economists I've looked at since covering Turkey in 2013. Covering Turkish economics, Turkish financial markets. But before we get into the background about Turkey and what's going on today, and with the elections coming up at the end of this month, could you give us a little bit of background about your life and your story and how you got into Turkish economics?
Thank you. Yeah, I think I'm the most seasoned applied economist. This is my 34th year covering Turkish economy, markets, and politics. Well, I was trained in the United States as an economist all the way to PhD level, but I didn't have the smarts to do academic research, and I certainly wasn't interested in a teaching career. So in 1990, I returned to Turkey and started working in the brokerage industry as research manager, director, whatever. And basically, I've been doing the same thing under different institutions. For 11 years, I worked in different banks and brokerage houses. Then I did TV on the side for 10 years as economics commentator, sometimes a moderator of programs. And for the last 24 years, concurrently with my TV and YouTube activities, I have a small consultancy, which is part of the Global Source Partners Emerging Markets Research Network. And I and my partners write about Turkish economy, Turkish markets, sometimes about companies and industries. And that's really all I have done. And this is what I intend to do for the rest of my life.
Very good. And you did your studies, did you study in the US after, or did you study in Turkey first?
No, I always studied in the United States just by pure luck. I got scholarships. This was 1980s. It was much easier. I studied in Illinois, Santa Barbara, California, and then finally, upstate New York.
Wow. Okay. So you went from East Coast to West Coast of the US and then now back to Turkey.
Exactly. I've got all three corners.
Great. You were probably in the heydays of when Michael Jordan was playing for the Chicago Bulls. But we're not here to talk basketball, we're here to talk about Turkey. So you talked about, you write and you comment a lot about Turkish economics and what's happening there. But what I really want to get from you, or a sense from you, is like Turkey to me has been really on the map in the, let's say, since 2003 with the financial markets. I know it's got like a long history from the Ottoman Empire up until today, but from say 2003, the last 20 years or the last 21 years, could you paint us a picture of what your thoughts are on the Turkish economy from say 2003 to say 2014? Because that's when I think things began to like turn in the Turkish economy.
Let me say a few words for the antebellum. I suppose that's the correct word. Actually, Turkey entered the foreign investors' radar in 1994 when it had a currency crisis, and the government issued what is called super bonds, 50% TL return for a 3-month bill. That's when serious interest started in Turkish financial markets. But you're completely right. For Turkey to become a permanent part of any emerging market portfolio starts in 2003 when Erdogan and his colleagues came to power in AKP party. And you're completely right. In the first 10 years or so, Erdogan and his colleagues, and I emphasize that words because up until 2015 or so, AKP was a collective endeavor, sort of like a cabinet or a committee of equals where Erdogan was simply the leader. Decisions were made collectively. Those were Turkey's golden years. I'm not going to talk about politics. Erdogan has always been Islamist and conservative. But in terms of economics, Turkey tripled its per capita GDP. It broke records in terms of total factor productivity, attracted huge amounts of not only hot money, but foreign direct investment. I mean, we came very close to becoming an EU member, but accession stopped. Now, why Turkey started stumbling after, you can pick any date between 2012, when Bernanke uttered the temper tantrum words, and 2014, but it's really irrelevant. So there is clearly a peak around that time. And since then, neither economically nor politically anything has gone wrong. I think to a large extent, as I've said, AKP's success in the earlier years was driven by the fact that it has many minds and it has its own internal checks and balances. Eventually, Erdogan eliminated all of his rivals, or they decided to leave the party. And, we see the same thing in China or Russia. Authoritarian or single man regimes don't do better. There's simply too much to do. And no man or women can have the mental facility to deal with all of these challenges. Secondly, when AKP came to power, it was under a lot of restrictions. On one hand, Bush was in Iraq, and Bush didn't really like Erdogan because we didn't permit American soldiers to use Turkish territory to enter northern Iraq. So, retribution from United States was one thing that kept Erdogan towed the line, quote unquote, become a good player of the international community. Two, the military and the judiciary, which was allied with the military, was quite successful, quite powerful, and they were always very skeptical about Erdogan's democratic credentials. So Erdogan essentially labored under coup threat until 2008 or so. Three, Turkey had an IMF program. Turkey needed the IMF program, and IMF essentially dictated most of the outlines of the economic policy. And that took Turkey to the great financial crises. After the great financial crisis, it was accepted that loose fiscal and monetary policies would be used to ameliorate the damage. And that's when Turkey's slippage started. But there are other reasons as well. The anchors or the restraints that tied Erdogan to orthodoxy or to good policy making have been disanchored one after another. The first was the coup accusations against generals and secularist elite, which were fabricated by an Islamic preacher and his organization called the Gülenists. Erdogan was very active in prosecuting generals. Essentially, it eliminated the military's sway over the Turkish democracy, which is a good thing, but what replaced it wasn't probably much better. And the secular elite, which were very outspoken in their criticism of Erdogan, were essentially put in prison or were given a choice between shutting up and being eliminated one way or other. Two, and I think that's what really changed the waters in Turkey, Sarkozy and Merkel made it quite clear that no matter what Turkey did, it would never become a member of EU simply because it was an Islamic country. And they did so in the most hurtful and insulting way by hiding behind the Cyprus crisis. Now, again, I'm not taking sides here, but from Turkey's perspective, there is not much that we could do to bring peace to the island. It was essentially up to Greek Cypriots to compromise, and that never happened. So Turkey's EU hopes were dashed. And the vision of EU was the holy grail of all people of Turkey, not only Turks, but Kurds, secularists, Islamists, the military, the liberals, etc., etc. It was the glue that tied Turkey on her path to the future. When that was eliminated, Erdogan really didn't have any reason to behave well. I mean, why would you behave in a certain way if you didn't expect to be rewarded for one reason or other? And the final blow was Erdogan and Fethullah Gülen, the leader, the spiritual leader, and the political leader of the Gülenist organization, had a very loud conflict, which resulted in Gülenists being completely purged from the Turkish power elite. That story actually lasts under 2016, when quite unimaginably, the Gülenists, in collusion with some of the generals in the army, have tried to stage a coup. And I think that was the final blow. Erdogan essentially became very paranoid. He lost all sense of trust in the segments of the population that weren't Islamists or that weren't members of Sunni tarikats. And, along with the institution of the presidential system, he essentially became the sole referee or arbitrator of all disputes. And the system didn't want to make any decisions. You know the word, the buck stops here. The buck always stopped at Erdogan's door. To give credit to the man or to the person, no one can make so many decisions correctly. But Mr. Erdogan never understood that. Instead of delegating authority, he thought the more power he consolidated in his office and his persona, the faster and more efficient things will get done, which brought us here, really. Up until 2018 or so, Turkey was in a permanent muddle-through mode. With the pandemic, it started its decline. Today, clearly, it's on the verge of crises. I mean, we live day by day in fear of crises. Is it going to be hyperinflation or another currency crisis? The appointment of Mehmet Şimşek, a name well known to markets and the industry, who espouses orthodox policies, promises some hope, but one never knows what Erdogan is going to do, not only in economics, but in terms of foreign policy as well, which our listeners from the Middle East and North Africa would know very well.
Yeah, that's a lot there. And I'd like to unpack some of that. I think if we go to what you say, and a lot of other people say, the golden years of, say, Turkey in the modern period, from 2003 to, say, 2014, I think it's fair to say Erdogan did do a lot economically, and his timing was good in a lot of things, and there were a lot of factors that were in his favor. I think when I was looking at some of the statistics, the poverty rate in Turkey declined, and the living standards improved, and all these other economic indicators like GDP per capita and output. And I remember in 2010, for example, I think the former foreign minister of Turkey, he talked about zero problems, and they were having relationships with countries like Syria. They were having a lot of relationships with Islamic countries, and I think the other thing that was really interesting to me is that the political economy was changing in Turkey over that decade. You had the Anatolian class coming into power, the traditional religious people from Anatolia who were maybe taking all these posts in the government. Would you say that these factors helped Erdogan in the early period?
Sure. Again, I mean, I've always been in opposition to Erdogan from day one. Ideologically, I'm a left-winger. I mean, I never denied that. But not to give him credit, not to give him and his team credit for pulling Turkey out of the low-income trap and making it a middle-income country with fairly modern physical infrastructure, an education system, a social welfare system, and institutions that were even praised by EU and the World Bank, is no mean achievement. I think after Özal, he is the greatest leader. It's very sad that whatever he gave to Turkey, he's taken back. There is no doubt about it. And you are right. I think his legacies permanent legacies are A, bringing the disenfranchised people of Anatolia, disenfranchised either because of their religious beliefs or because of simply their geography, to the center of Turkish politics and economy. Single-handedly, AKP created the Turkish conservative or Islamist bourgeoisie, the middle class. These people moved to the cities not only in a physical sense, but also in a mental sense. They became urbanites, and their habits, all the way from voting to consumption patterns to their attitudes towards social life, have moderated and have become more modern. And he brought equality. There is no doubt about it. I mean, Turkey didn't really have a functioning welfare system before Erdogan came to power. But even now, despite all of its shortcomings, Turkey's welfare system, at least in principle, or in its coverage, in its expanse, very similar to Scandinavian democracies. Essentially, everybody gets something from the state. So I cannot really deny any of these successes. But again, I suppose it is the nature of uncontested political power that it gravitates towards authoritarianism, that it always has internal conflicts, which leads to purges, and it creates its own chronic class. And all of these things happened in Turkey, in addition to what I describe as exogenous or external factors which changed Erdogan behavior. But at the end, I think his legacy will always be cherished. And it's really up to him whether he can make up for the mistakes of his latter reign in the few remaining years before he retires or, expires by natural causes.
Why do you think a lot of, at the time, say between 2003 and 2014, a lot of countries in the region, Arab countries, let's say, and by extension, Islamic countries like Indonesia, I remember hearing back in 2010, before the uprisings in the Middle East in 2011, a lot of countries in the region wanted to emulate Turkey because, it was successful, as you said, very successful economically, and politically it seemed very stable. Why do you think a lot of countries at that time looked at Turkey as a model for their system?
Because I think Turkey managed something that's very rare in Islamic world or in countries with very large Muslim minorities, which is we reconciled capitalism and a secular lifestyle with Islam. For a long time, it looked like, I think the idea that underdevelopment is inherent to Islam was completely dispelled because of Turkey's case. The fact that you can't have an Islamic democracy was completely dispelled in Turkey. And of course, above and beyond these philosophical and social observations, for Arabs and other Islam countries, Turkey was extremely attractive because by then, we were the only Muslim country that were close to acceding to European Union. I mean, imagine, I don't know whether you believe in the clash of civilizations or whether our audience does, but if it is taking place, then up until a certain point, Turkey was the country which could disprove that this had to be the way, that it wasn't natural or preordained, that countries by conscious efforts and consensus building could, change their fate. So I think not only to Arab countries, but I think a lot of countries in the Balkans certainly wanted to emulate Turkey's example. And you mentioned the foreign minister, Professor Ahmet Davutoğlu, then prime minister and currently leader of an opposition party. Some of his theories are pretty crazy, like the recreation of the old Ottoman influence sphere, not necessarily militarily or politically, but as a sociological entity where all the nations have affinity to each other, so we can build a co-prosperity sphere. That's, Turks may think that the Ottoman era was good for the subject nations, but that remains our opinion. I've never seen any of the subjects of colonial powers liking them. I don't know. So that part was crazy. But the idea that we wanted to establish peace with all of our neighbors, including, Greece, as well as to change the single-minded focus on Europe and the Western civilization, which is the heritage of Atatürk, to a more moderate and encompassing approach, so that we would easily, without any pre-hesitation or prejudice, deal with Iran, Russia, or Syria, or Saudi Arabia, was a revolution. I mean, I'm a secularist, but I don't agree with some of its agenda. I mean, for a long time, even Özal hesitated to license Islamic banks in Turkey because they were believed to be spies for Saudi Arabia. This is how bad it was. I mean, look, fascism, Islamism, secularism, communism, they all have their extremes. And we have experienced those. And coming from such a background, and then just, pushing aside all of these preconceived notions and dealing with countries on the merits of their, political position or their economic benefits was truly revolutionary. And I think that too will stay. For a while, Erdogan, completely dispensed with zero problems policy, but now he's going back to it.
Yeah. And then probably after, say, 2014, would you say that's when things started to change? I remember in 2013 when the Gezi Park uprisings happening, and I think that's when, for me, a lot of things changed in Turkey. This is me as an outsider saying that, but that's when I could see Turkey was changing in that way. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, there are two theories on why Erdogan changed completely. I mean, he's not the man we know when he first came to power. First is he was always the man he is today, but he simply didn't find the opportunity to manifest his true colors. The second theory is circumstances. He changed because circumstances didn't give him an opportunity or gave him or opened a path to him that allowed him to consolidate that much power. Honestly, even though I don't like Erdogan, I criticize him all the time, empirically, I don't know which one is true. I can't read people's intents. I'm not a mind reader. But I would certainly give weight to the second theory, in the sense that, honestly, the betrayals from EU, not the generals, it turned out to be that the generals never plotted a coup, but the betrayals from EU and the Gülenists are huge shocks, which in the personal life of any person would create deep and lasting traumas. Now, Gezi is a different episode. I didn't mention it, but because, the history of Gezi still needs to be investigated. The current rhetoric, the pro-government rhetoric, is that Gezi was a plot by foreign powers to destabilize Turkey. And I think a lot of nationalist Turks, whether they like Erdogan or not, and a lot of xenophobic Turks, unfortunately, xenophobia also came with Erdogan, give credence to this theory. To me, Gezi Park was endogenous, a grassroots movement. But what it did is, I think it demonstrated to Erdogan that no matter what he did, half the population was against him. There was nothing he could do to gain their votes or to gain their hearts. So there was no reason to treat them equally. And I think that started the slippery slope towards the current hierarchical system in Turkey, which is, in my view, as bad as the caste system in India or the past caste system, in the sense that there is a certain pyramid of privileges and responsibilities. At the top are male Sunni Muslims, okay? And at the very bottom are LGBT, women, and the Kurds who refuse to be assimilated. Turkish society has become very stratified at many levels. Perhaps it was always like that. I wouldn't argue against it, but we have a modern state that to a certain extent pushed against this stratification. State was a modernizing factor. Now, unfortunately, the state has become the same as the party, which has become the same as Erdogan's persona. And Mr. Erdogan clearly and very openly pursues a policy of forced Islamization.
With I've read articles when Erdogan was when he initiated this macroeconomic policy of changing things, and you've mentioned about unorthodox economic policy. Would you say his philosophy in life and his background influences his decision making with regards to the economy?
Yeah, I think economically he was always a novice or a rookie. All of the economic decisions were made by Ali Babacan and then Mehmet Şimşek. There was 4 people formed the AKP party, the 4 founding fathers. I keep forgetting the name of the gentleman who bailed out the earliest, but he was also then he became a CHP deputy. I'm sorry.
Would you just ask you a question? Would you say that AKP is the Turkish branch of the Muslim Brotherhood? Would you say that's fair?
No, I think they're affiliated. It's sort of that would be like saying the pro-Kurdish Dem Party is an extension of PKK. It isn't, but there's affiliation. They do share certain priorities. They are inspired by each other. First, Necmettin Erbakan was inspired by Muslim Brotherhood, and then Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt was inspired by Erdogan. But these are, again, Muslim Brotherhood is largely an Arabic movement, which is peculiar to Arab geography. And Turkish Islam is a different animal, which has certain affinity to Arab nations, but we do have our own priorities and our own peculiarities. So anyhow, see, Erdogan would have probably erred on economic policy several times, but he was vetoed because the majority, like Abdullah Gül, who was at least nominally his superior, and my God, my memory is so bad. The other older gentleman, Bülent Arınç, who wasn't an economist, but he was a clear thinker. So Ali Babacan, Abdullah Gül, Bülent Arınç, the other gentleman whose name I keep forgetting, vetoed, in my theory, Erdogan's silly decisions. And I think what happened is, this is more of a speculative viewpoint, this 20-year-long QE policy of printing endless money and driving interest rates to zero gave license to a lot of bad governments to pursue silly policies and to claim they're revolutionary. Okay, if you have like a world like today where bad decision making, bad policy making is immediately punished by international institutions, fund managers, commercial banks, not lending to you or not investing in your country, it limits your maneuvering room. There was a period between 2008 to 2000, probably until the pandemic, where people really didn't care whether a country had good governance or not. That was the quest for yield. You couldn't go wrong. Essentially fed, backed all the fund managers' positions. They weren't allowed to make a loss in fear of stoking another financial crisis. And Erdogan probably thought, well, I experimented with this. They told me it was disastrous, but it worked. So why not to do more? And eventually, of course, it's adverse selection. You do something silly, people tell you it's wrong, but there are always some syncopaths who would tell you, Emperor, you are doing great. And he filled his echo chamber with people, yes-sayers, who invented a new economic theory for him. I mean, it was called Islamic economics. Honestly, I've explored quite a bit, probably not enough, but quite a bit. I couldn't find any reference to Islamic economics being any different than perhaps giving more emphasis to social justice. It doesn't have a different economic theory. And that was created or concocted quite out of thin air by Mr. Erdogan's advisors like Yiğit Bulut and Cemil Ertan and later Berat Albayrak. I'm just spewing names to make sure our audience understands. I'm not completely making this up. But you have a whole generation of economists or pseudo-economists that were trying to prove the basic Washington consensus macroeconomic policy and the almost the ironclad laws of demand and supply, claiming that Turkey could have zero real interest rate, huge amount of fixed investment, and no inflation. And clearly that led to disaster.
Yeah, it seems like he had this vision of like I'm sure from your research in Islamic economics and Islamic finance, it's to me it's a completely different economic model to what's practiced in the day-to-day in the reality. As you mentioned about social justice, and I think this idea of no interest, which it is a tenet of Islamic finance. It seems to Erdogan has this obsession that no interest, like low interest rates equates to low inflation, but in a fractional reserve banking system or a system based on interest, I don't think that was really possible, right?
Yeah, that's the problem. I mean, again, look, Islamic nation constitutionally so bans interest. Fine, I don't care. I mean, that's their choice. They live with the consequences. But transitioning a system which has been built on secular and capitalist lines for 80 years to a Islamic system is impossible. It's simply not institutionally possible. Also, there's a certain amount of hypocrisy involved here because Erdogan obviously wasn't against interest rates because of his religious beliefs, as we are seeing today. And that's really what bothers me. It is irrational. I can perfectly understand a person who, because of his or her religious beliefs, refuses interest. Fine. Again, that person or that country lives with the consequences. But using Quran or the fundamentals of Islam to cut interest rates for other purposes or with ulterior motives was completely wrong. And at the end, I think it to a certain extent disgraced his legacy and his credibility, even among hardcore Islamists in Turkey.
Yeah, and if you look at like other countries which have quote unquote Islamic finance systems, like we take countries like Sudan, Iran, other countries which right now their economies are not doing too great or haven't been doing too great for the last say 2-3 decades. I don't know why Erdogan didn't see like other examples of where they tried to implement this kind of system of Islamic economics.
Again, I see the problem with Erdogan is he's not very well educated. And he certainly doesn't know anything about economy. Unfortunately, he claims that he does. I don't know much about Sudan, but a little bit about Iran and Saudi Arabia. We may criticize their governance from a lot of different perspectives, but they have very well educated cadres, bureaucracies. And there's always a sort of inter-party or inter-elite competition, which creates some checks or balances. Honestly, Turkey has become, over 10 years, a completely different animal, where no one dares to disagree with Erdogan. And in fact, quite the opposite. If Erdogan says something, people prepare the context or excuses to prove him right. That to me is unique. Perhaps I'm not well versed in international, economics or policy making, but the way people flocked to Erdogan and gave him what he wanted is very unique. Also, the complete dismantlement of the institutional base of Turkey is striking. I mean, there is simply nothing, no parliament, no opposition, no judiciary, no public unrest on the streets, no inter-party competition to stop Erdogan. And I think that's wrong. Even if I was in this position, I wouldn't accept that post. I think the test case here is Xi Jinping. China is becoming, from a decision-making perspective, like Turkey. And here I make a very bold claim that China will pay the price very dearly. It's simply impossible for one person, no matter how ingenious that person may be, to deal with the challenges of a complex economy, of the social structures, and as well as the rising geopolitical tensions. And Erdogan still thinks he can do all of it, and he's doing a great disservice to himself and to his nation.
So he had these ideas on economics and policy making, and I would say since, say, 2014, maybe a bit later when he became president, or they changed the system to a presidential system. It's probably say since 2018 he implemented this policy of low interest rates, and he would think that this meant low inflation. What kind of we saw the impact on the currency? Could you paint a picture of how bad was this for the Turkish lira?
Well, first of all, it was bad for inflation, and I think that drives the volatility in Turkish lira. Turkey, like Latin American countries, had a very checkered history when it came to inflation. We lived with very high, almost hyperinflation for 3 decades. And then, because of IMF and good policies of AKP, Independent Central Bank, Turkey experienced 10 years of low inflation, where relative prices or the price level didn't change much. It wasn't part of the national discourse. And as of 2018, inflation started picking up again. Of course, expectations being sticky, the inflationary pressures were slow to build up. But today, officially, we have 65% inflation. Perceived inflation is probably close to 100%. Now, that's the main reason why Turkish lira, which was one of the strongest up until 2016 or so against the dollar, suddenly stumbled. The other reason is, if you think, and that's part of the Erdogan economic tenet that people don't discuss much, if you think an economy doesn't have any boundaries to its growth rate, as long as you pump demand, increase government spending, or decrease interest rates, you can grow by an equal measure, is silly. In Turkey, the reflection of that is a huge explosion in imports, simply because Turkey is energy dependent and dependent on high technology investment goods. So one side effect of prioritizing economic growth at the expense of anything not only meant inflation, but also unsustainable current account deficits. Now, that was a very slow-burning fuse because, as I've said, the international environment was so benign that it was willing to finance a country even though its current account deficits was above and beyond any number that would be acceptable as sustainable. But eventually, the well dried up. So what did Erdogan do? Instead of a policy revision or even a policy review, he started, his team, Berat Albayrak, his son-in-law, started instituting capital controls. Politely speaking, in financial economics, it's called financial repression. But essentially, unless you want to send abroad $10,000, $15,000 for your child or for your spouse, you couldn't really transfer money out of the country. A lot of financial markets, like the swap market, were suddenly shut closed. And Turkey wasted hundreds of billions of dollars of reserves in trying to defend a currency which was undefensible. Now, part of it went to foreign investors. I think right before local elections, in 2019 local elections, the official foreign financial investment stock in Turkey was around $120 billion. When Mehmet Şimşek came to power, that was $12 billion. So foreigners took their money and left. And by defending an artificially inflated currency, we actually allowed them a very cheap exit. And two, Turkish savers switched to dollars. At the zenith of the Turkish experiment, when Turkey was doing very well, the ratio of hard currency deposits in the banking system to total deposits was 34%, which is not small, but given Turkey's very long history of chronic inflation, it was actually understandable. As of today, that ratio, including options on FX options on TL deposits, called FX protected deposit scheme, is 65%. So essentially, people dollarized. And obviously, look. Unless you are willing to impose strict capital controls, you cannot defend the currency against the dollar if you have a current account deficit and if your own people demand dollars. It just doesn't work that way. This is why the joke in Turkey is, if only Turkey could print dollars, we would have no problems.
And then, how did that impact things like FDI inflows? Did that have a negative impact? All these negative policy making, did that have an impact as well?
Yeah, I think FDI completely dried up at a time when we really needed it because the domestic industry just didn't have the technology to move up at the value-added ladder. But the primary reason why FDI turned away from Turkey is absence of rule of law. I mean, this is not a country that abides by any regulation, which is, it is fine if there is foreseeability, predictability. But Turkey is not only in the commercial sense a lawless country, but also it's an unpredictable country. I mean, next day the tax rates could be doubled, or you could be asked not to raise your prices, even though your costs are up by 100%. So that's the one reason. But secondly, currency volatility. I mean, if you buy a factory in Turkey, that's a 10-year decision, and you want to make sure that you will get some kind of dividends or capital appreciation. Why would I invest into a country where the currency constantly depreciates and the authorities deny there is a problem? So, the damage has been multifaceted. I mean, today we're talking about capital exodus. Turkish companies are setting up in places like Central Asia, some in Balkans, Romania, Bulgaria, but also in Egypt, which is great. I mean, we should help Egypt. And the main reason is not only currency instability, but also because really no one can do any planning as long as you have a government where the budget law gives the president, not the parliament, the president, the authority to adjust taxes by 100%. So, I mean, how am I supposed to do business in a country like this?
Yeah, it seems like in the past couple of years, financial flows seem to be returning, but like FDI flows, they take a long time to return, or take at least 3 or 4 years to return. Attila, one thing I wanted to ask you is that the debt levels in Turkey seem to be quite elevated. But the thing is that we'll get to the period of the last year or so in a second, but it seems that bond investors or fixed income investors, particularly internationally and in the Middle East, they still seem to be quite interested in the Turkish story. Why do you think they're still buying Turkish Eurobonds or Turkish debt?
Well, because Turkish total foreign debt is quite high, but the public debt is very low. The public debt to GDP ratio, and some of it is Turkish lira, that is only 30%. I think the emerging markets average is something like 65%. Now, obviously, Turkish Treasury hides certain liabilities, which we call contingent liabilities. I'm not going to bother our audience with technicalities, but essentially, we have Treasury guaranteed loans to private sector. But even if, and state bank losses, which need to be recapitalized, but even if you add those, you would get a ratio like 40%. It is the private sector that's hugely indebted. This is why Turkish Eurobonds are extremely popular. And also there is history. I mean, Argentina is a serious defaulter, whereas Turkey never defaulted, not since Ottoman era. We should have a better credit score. Also, that is a funny thing in Turkey. For instance, consumer debt is fairly low. Corporate leverage is fairly high. Banks, by definition, have to borrow from abroad. So overall debt looks very bad. Also, over the last few years, because of this preoccupation with growth at any cost, the budget deficits have expanded. That what the fiscal stimulus was really the only driving force behind economic growth, which added to domestic debt. I don't have clear figures on domestic debt, but let me tell you this much. I mean, this financial repression regime I mentioned, which was in place for 3-4 years, also forced banks to buy Turkish lira government bonds at very low interest rates. So essentially, part of the fiscal burden was shifted to banks, which also artificially suppressed the public debt to GDP ratio.
And during this period, up until say the last couple of years, Turkey had a very close relationship with Qatar, right? How much was Qatar's support important to the Turkish economy?
Right. I'm sorry, could you repeat your last question?
Up until like say the last year or so, Turkey still is today very close to Qatar. But how important was Qatari support to Turkey during this period?
I think in terms of central bank financing, it was indispensable. Turkey came very close to currency crises twice in 2021 and before the elections. And we have seen sudden and inexplicable increases in central bank foreign exchange reserves. Qatar contributed, Saudi Arabia did. I speculate Azerbaijan did, Russia did, but clearly Qatar was in the lead. Qatar was also very interested in investing in Turkey's real assets and did, in fact, purchase a few banks and some other assets. But the problem is with the Qataris, as well as with any other investor, is again, there are no rules. I mean, not necessarily, this is not necessarily political partisanship or Erdogan stealing money. It's just that his policy priorities change every day. And when these change, regardless of nationality, you suffer the side effects. So, I'm fairly sure the Arabs, Qatar, not only Qataris, but all the Gulf nations would be willing to invest in Turkish real assets because they're really cheap right now. But they are not simply because, as everyone else, they're waiting to make sure that Erdogan will stay on the path of orthodox or accepted convention in economic policy and not go back to those, radically crazy ideas.
Yeah. And then if we look at the last year or so, obviously there was a devastating earthquake in Turkey, also in northern Syria as well. A lot of people lost their lives. Yeah. Big destruction. It requires a lot of reconstruction. The presidential elections which took place last year, Erdogan, prior to the election, he promised a lot of spending and he promised a lot of stimulus and all these kind of things. How much of an impact did that have on the Turkish economy?
Huge. I mean, all the polls show Erdogan losing, but clearly, they couldn't measure how much he paid the people to vote for him. And this is legitimate. Don't misunderstand me. When I paid, I don't mean bribing, but at the end, people look at their own bottom line. And I think given a very uncertain and untested coalition of 6 parties on one hand, and on the other hand, a leader that continually promises to feed you and a very expensive welfare system, at the end, people said, well, we'll stay with Erdogan. Okay, there's inflation, currency is volatile, but at the end, I get compensated for all of these. So, your income gets a hit from currency devaluation or inflation. 6 months later, Erdogan raises salaries and you make up for it. And I think this kind of certainty, though very fragile and probably quite miserable for the ones who are at the bottom of the income rank ladder, is preferable to people who promise economic policies which they don't quite understand.
Right. And it seems like 2022 and 2023 were inflection years for Turkey. They repaired relations with the UAE, they repaired relations with Saudi Arabia. I think Erdogan and both the leaders from both those countries visited Turkey and vice versa. There seems to be a lot more Saudi investment and UAE investment coming to Turkey. Why do you think Erdogan decided to repair relations with these two countries in the last couple of years?
Honestly, I don't know, but you're quite right. I mean, Erdogan's turn to pragmatism, which was his hallmark in the first 10 years of his reign, started with foreign policy. Mehmet Şimşek came much later. It could be because he might have recognized that he couldn't win, that Turkey had too many enemies and not enough leverage to deal with all of them. It could be because even though he's not an economist or accountant, he inherently sensed that Turkey's economic progression was unsustainable and he needed money. And that money wasn't going to come from the West. And so he had to improve relations with Gulf countries and perhaps even treat EU and the United States better to make sure that he has financing and Turkey doesn't, run from one crisis to another one. But quite honestly with you, this is widely debated why Erdogan suddenly turned pragmatic, why he started doing things we thought he would never do. He himself confessed that he would never do. That's a mystery. Again, certain things take time to analyze, in particular in countries like Turkey, where the decision-making process is completely non-transparent and the free press, well, doesn't exist, frankly. So we still don't know the answer. I think in terms of why he changed economic policy, which came after his moderation in foreign policy, he probably asked Azerbaijan, Russia, and the Arab nations for more financing. And they said, fine, Turkey's attractive. We appreciate Turkey's friendship, but you have to, appoint responsible economic managers. And probably, speculatively, that is the kind of constraint or the vector that compelled Erdogan to bring back Mehmet Şimşek.
Yeah, and him bringing him back, and I think also bringing the former central bank, well, the now former central bank governor, she had a very illustrious career in Wall Street, albeit as Silicon Valley Bank, which went belly up afterwards. But I remember us talking last year about this prior to the election, the presidential election, and I think I don't know if you still hold the view that it's still too early to say whether this is fully returned to orthodox policymaking. Do you still have that view today?
Yes, but with much less conviction. I think Erdogan allowing an interest rate hike, and a substantial one, a couple of days before elections, proves to me that he has changed a lot. That doesn't mean he will always pursue rational or orthodox policies, but I think the bar for him to go back to this completely heterodox or irrational policies are quite high right now. Also, one difference, which is not mentioned either in the international press or in Turkish circles, is that he owns this program. I mean, he provides oral support, he backs the program. In the past, when a central bank governor was forced to hike rates or budget cuts had to be initiated, he always distanced himself from the decision, claiming those agencies were independent and philosophically his views haven't changed. But now he seems to have completely bought into the economic program in the sense that his rhetoric vis-a-vis the economy is pretty much identical to what Mehmet Şimşek is saying. So again, the problem with Erdogan is 25 years of experience of unpredictability. And to erase that notion in my mind is very impossible. It will take time. But what I'm seeing to me is much more encouraging than what I have told you right around the last year's elections.
Yeah. And as we bring the podcast to a close shortly, Attila, what are your expectations for 2024? And I mean, we're coming to the end of the first quarter. We've got an election at the end in a couple of days' time. How important are these elections that are going to take place in Turkey?
I think they're quite important simply because, Turkish economic policy cannot be discussed without referencing politics. If these are indeed the last elections, then Erdogan has 4 more years until the next. And I'm fairly sure he'll grant Mehmet Şimşek the necessary authority to pursue a very strict austerity program, what in Turkish circles is colloquially called a standby without IMF. And that's what Turkey needs, unfortunately. I'm sorry. But again, I don't want to get into political scenarios, but there are outcomes, for instance, if he wins Istanbul, which doesn't look likely, but hey, this is Turkey. He may be encouraged to grant himself another term, which would require a constitutional change, or he could call early elections. Obviously, we have seen what happens to Turkish budget and monetary policy or to inflation when elections are in progress or elections are on the horizon. So Turkey is sort of like facing this very bifurcated future, and the switching the switching toggle is election results. If you ask my opinion, AKP will do much better than 2019, but for some reason Erdogan turned his entire election about Istanbul, and he will lose Istanbul, and he will realize he doesn't have the mandate at this point to try his hand at more elections, which would give Mehmet Şimşek the time and the wherewithal to, strict austerity program. If this is the case, obviously Turkey will have a recession or slow growth, very similar to recession. But I think towards the end of 2024, we would see central bank reserves increasing to a level that would end the discomfort about a currency crisis and inflation really coming down. I mean, obviously not, even low double digits, but there would be measurable progress in the minds and in the pockets of people that inflation is really coming down. And in 2025, if we can stick on the program, Turkey could have maybe 20% inflation, a 3% current account deficit as compared to GDP, which is financeable, and will become a normal country. And then we can talk about structural reforms and what Turkey needs to do to get back to the track of development, to get out of the middle income crisis.
Yeah, and linked to the economic and political developments in Turkey, I think it's also fair to say that Turkey's having to manage a lot of geopolitical challenges in its region. You've got the Ukraine-Russia conflict, you've got the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, you also got the sad conflict in Gaza. How do you think Turkey's going to manage navigating through all these different conflicts?
I think it's very difficult. Again, I don't want to give a very lengthy discussion because we're exceeding our time limits, or at least, my mental limits. But Erdogan, even though he won't admit it, probably would prefer a stalemate in Ukraine, because then both Ukraine and Russia depend Turkey more. And a Russia tied down in Ukraine is incapable of forcing decisions on Turkey in the Caucasus and Syria space. I think the big bonus for Erdogan would be Trump's re-election. Once again, Trump is as unpredictable as Erdogan, but judging by what he's promising on the campaign trail, his policies are very positive for Turkey, such as, cutting aid to Ukraine, which would, prolong the war. Let me clarify myself. I think if Ukraine gets military aid, Putin will at some point realize that he cannot get much more out of Ukraine, and peace talks will be possible. But if Ukraine doesn't get the money, I'm afraid this war will get much more ugly. I don't see Ukrainians surrendering one way or other. Trump will also help with other matters like Turkey being reinvited to the F-35 program, American soldiers be pulling out of Syria. So we can, not that I approve of it, but Turkey dealing, quote unquote, dealing with Syrian Kurds. In Gaza, again, I think what's happening there is ethnic cleansing, to say the least, if not just genocide. In the beginning of the Gaza operation, when the losses were lower and Netanyahu's murderous intent was less clear-cut, Erdogan might have infuriated the West and the Arab nations by being too loud and too critical of Netanyahu. But this is one point where he proved right. I think now even the Biden administration came to the point that Netanyahu is a dead end. And I don't think Turkey's Gaza policy is out of line from anyone else at this point.
Yeah, no, let's just hope I think the UN voted for a ceasefire or called for a ceasefire yesterday, but 6 months too late. Attila, what are your current projects and what are you up to in addition to your consultancy?
I'm very happy with my job. Again, I consider myself blessed because my job is my hobby. This is what I like to do. I would like to write more books about Turkish economy, both in Turkish and English, and hopefully expand the reach of my English YouTube channel, which has a very tiny audience. Clearly, I'm not a native speaker of English and production quality is zero, but I would like to be known as a person who reflects unbiased and relatively calm-headed view of what's going on in Turkish politics and economy.
Great. And you said you have a YouTube channel. What's your YouTube channel?
It's called Real Turkey Channel. Yeah.
And are you on other social media platforms or is it just YouTube?
It's on YouTube only. I am very active in social media. I have an English language Twitter account. I post in Facebook and LinkedIn in English language as well. I have quite a few followers, but again, my pet project, my hobby is to develop my English language YouTube channel. I am too old for TikTok, Twitch, and even Instagram. I still don't understand, Hassan.
No, it's definitely your YouTube content is really helpful and valuable to people who want to learn about Turkey. Atilla Shayada, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for coming on.
It's been my pleasure. I hope our audience enjoyed it, and I want to, congratulate you once again for this very useful project. I hope you stay online for many years to come, Hassan.
Thank you so much, Attila. Thank you.